So, my neighbor decided to sell peace and quiet, right up against a working cattle ranch. And I mean right up against it. Like, close enough to hear a gate latch, close enough to smell a feed truck before it even turns the corner, close enough that if one of my steers sneezes, somebody's paying $400 a night is going to think it's part of the immersive experience. Now here's the thing. I've been running cattle on this land outside of Red Hollow, Wyoming. Well, that's what we'll call it. For over 20 years, same pastures my dad worked, same fence lines my grandfather hammered in with hands that didn't care about splinters or weather or comfort. This isn't some postcard ranch where people come take photos in clean boots and pretend they understand the land. This is work, real work. Schedules that don't care about weekends, animals that don't care about your vacation itinerary, and mornings that start long before the sun even thinks about showing up. So when I first heard that the parcel along my east fence sold to some guy from out of state, let's call him Trevor, I didn't think much of it. Land changes hands. That's just how things go. But then within a few months, things started looking different. First, it was the platforms, raised wood decks spaced out like someone was planning a wedding that never ends. Then came the canvas tents, big ones, the kind that scream luxury but make it rustic. Then the string lights, warm yellow bulbs stretched between posts like fireflies on command. And finally, the sign, polished, carved, standing proud like it belonged there. Whispering Prairie Retreat, luxury glamping experience. And I remember standing there one evening, leaning on my fence, watching them finish setting it up, and thinking, man, they really believe this place is quiet. Because what they were selling, tranquil sunrises, untouched prairie silence, that wasn't wrong exactly. It just wasn't the whole truth. See, that silence they were advertising? It exists, but only between operations, only in the gaps, in the pauses between engines, hooves, wind pushing dust across dry ground, cattle moving, gates opening, men calling out to each other across distance. It's a working rhythm, not a frozen picture. At first, I stayed out of it. Zoning allowed short-term rentals, nothing illegal about what Trevor was doing, and honestly, I figured maybe his guests would enjoy seeing real ranch life up close, might even learn something. But the problem wasn't what he built, it was where he built it. Several of those tents ended up right along my primary grazing pasture, and when I say right along, I mean separated by nothing more than standard livestock fencing, the kind designed to keep cattle in, not keep curious tourists out. And sure enough, it didn't take long. First week they opened, I saw people leaning over the rails, phones out, snapping pictures like they'd discovered something wild and exotic. Then came the feeding, because of course it did, someone tossing scraps over the fence, thinking they were helping, like these are backyard pets and not 1,200-pound animals with digestive systems that don't forgive mistakes. So I walked over, introduced myself, kept it polite, explained the basics. Cattle spook easy, foreign food can make them sick, fences are not invitations. And Trevor, to his credit, nodded along, said all the right things, told me guests would be informed, that everything would be handled responsibly. And for a minute, I believed him. But then, the reviews started showing up online. Complaints, mostly subtle at first, little things. Engine noise early in the morning, dust drifting across the tents, the smell. Yeah, the smell of an actual ranch, like that was somehow a surprise. And then one review caught my eye. Someone wrote they were violently awakened before sunrise by shouting and thunderous hoofbeats. And I remember reading that, and just laughing, because I knew exactly what day they were talking about. That was rotation week. See, in summer, you move cattle at dawn, not because it's convenient, but because it's necessary. Cooler temperatures keep the animals calm, reduce stress, prevent injury. It's not optional. It's standard practice. And years ago, I used to run that drive along the eastern fence line. The same fence line Trevor decided would make a perfect backdrop for luxury camping. But over time, I'd shifted routes for convenience. Easier access, less wear on certain gates, just small adjustments you make after doing something long enough. But standing there, reading those complaints, hearing about how disruptive our normal operations were to his carefully curated serenity, something clicked. Not anger, not even frustration, just clarity. Because the land hadn't changed. The work hadn't changed. The only thing that changed was the audience. So I went back to the original route. No announcement, no confrontation, no drama. Just back to what worked best for the cattle. And that's when things really started to get interesting. Now, before we keep rolling with the story, let me slow this down for a second, because what's happening here? It's not just about cattle and glamping tents. This is one of those situations where lifestyle fantasy crashes headfirst into operational reality, and that collision follows a pretty predictable pattern. From a legal perspective, what Trevor stepped into, without really understanding it, is something called right to farm protection. And no, it's not some obscure loophole farmers pull out when they feel like being difficult. It's actually baked into law in most rural states, designed specifically to protect long-standing agricultural operations from exactly this kind of conflict. Basically, if a ranch has been operating legally for years, sometimes generations, you can't move in next door, decide you don't like the noise, the smell, or the schedule, and then force that ranch to change how it works. That's not how it goes. According to standard procedure, the burden isn't on the rancher to adapt to new neighbors. The burden is on the newcomer to understand the environment they're entering. And here's where it gets interesting. Because legally, Trevor wasn't wrong to build his glamping site. Zoning allowed it. Permits were approved. Everything looked clean on paper. But legality and compatibility are two very different things. This is a psychological trap a lot of people fall into, especially when money and aesthetics get involved. They see open land, wide skies, a sense of peace, and they assume that peace is passive, that it just exists naturally, untouched, like a backdrop waiting for their experience to unfold. But in reality, that landscape is active, it's maintained, it's worked, it's loud in its own way, just not in the way city noise is loud. And when expectations don't match reality, people don't usually blame their assumptions, they blame the environment. That's why those reviews started showing up, not because anything changed, but because perception did. And once perception shifts, conflict isn't far behind. So once I switched the route back, things didn't explode overnight. Not in some dramatic, yelling across the fence kind of way. It was slower than that, like pressure building where nobody wants to admit it's there. First rotation morning after the change, 5:30 sharp, same as always. My crew rolls in half awake, but steady, saddles creaking, engines turning over with that low diesel rumble that carries just enough in the quiet before sunrise, gates clanking open one by one. And then the herd starts moving, slow at first, then gathering rhythm, hooves hitting dry ground in that deep, rolling cadence you feel more than hear. Dust lifts naturally, not some cinematic exaggeration, just the land doing what it does when a few hundred animals pass through it. And we call to each other like we always have, short, direct, no wasted words, push left, hold the line, easy now. Nothing new, nothing aggressive, just work. But across that fence, whole different scene. You've got people stepping out onto their little wooden decks wrapped in blankets. Phones already up, some whispering like they're watching a nature documentary, others not so charmed. I remember one guy in a pressed flannel, probably bought it for the trip, standing there squinting like the sun itself had personally offended him, and a woman next to him covering her nose, looking around like she was trying to figure out who allowed reality to interrupt her weekend. And I'll admit, there was a part of me that noticed that contrast and thought, well, yeah, this is what you signed up next to. Now for a couple weeks, that's how it played out. No direct complaints to me, just more online reviews popping up, tone shifting from rustic charm to unexpected disturbances. And then one morning, Trevor finally walks over. Not rushed, not angry, just that tight kind of controlled frustration where someone's trying real hard to stay professional while everything underneath is starting to crack. He stops at the fence, hands in his pockets, looks out over the pasture like he's trying to calculate something invisible. Then he goes, "Hey, can we talk about the mornings?" And I already know where this is headed, so I lean on the post, give him a nod, let him say it his way. He tells me guests are complaining, that the experience isn't matching what was advertised, that the early noise, engines, shouting, the cattle, it's disruptive. He uses that word twice. Disruptive. Like what we're doing is some kind of interruption instead of the baseline reality of the place. Then he says, maybe you could push it a little later? Just a couple hours. Let people enjoy the sunrise first. And I just kind of look at him for a second, not trying to be difficult, just making sure he hears how that sounds outside his own head. And I tell him, calm as I can, the cattle don't run on guest schedules. I explain the heat, the stress, how moving them later in the day isn't just inconvenient. It's bad practice, could even be dangerous depending on conditions, and I remind him, gently but clearly, that this ranch has been operating like this long before his first tent went up. He listens, but you can tell, he's not hearing it the way I'm saying it. He's filtering it through bookings, reviews, expectations, business pressure. Then he shifts tactics, offers to pay for a taller fence, says it'll block the view, reduce the impact, make it better for both sides. And that's the moment where it stops being about compromise and starts being about control. Because a taller fence doesn't change the noise, doesn't change the dust, doesn't change the fact that this is a working ranch, it just hides it, turns it into something you don't have to look at while still expecting it to behave differently. So I shake my head, not dismissive, just firm, and tell him the current fencing meets code. Everything we're doing is lawful agricultural use, and I'm not interested in modifying operations to match a marketing promise I didn't make. That lands not well. He nods, but it's that kind of nod people give when they've already decided you're the problem. After that, things get quieter between us, not peaceful, just distant. But behind the scenes, you can see him adjusting. A few tents get moved farther back from the fence line. Not all, but enough to create some buffer. And then I notice the website changes, subtle at first, a line added here, a phrase tweaked there, and eventually it's right there in the description. Located near an active working ranch, guests may experience authentic agricultural sights and sounds. And I remember reading that and thinking, yeah, that's closer to the truth. Meanwhile, on my side, nothing changes. Same schedule, same routes, same mornings that start in the dark and unfold the way they always have. No extra noise, no intentional disruption, just consistency. And over time, something interesting happens. The complaints don't disappear, but they change. You start seeing reviews from people who came prepared, who knew what they were walking into, who described the cattle drives as raw, real, even the highlight of the trip. And the ones who didn't like it, they stopped being surprised, because now they were told. And that's really where it settles. Not in some big resolution where everyone shakes hands and agrees, but in an adjustment of expectations. Trevor didn't lose his business. I didn't change mine. The land kept doing what it's always done. The only real shift was understanding. So what's the lesson here? Because on the surface, this just sounds like a classic country versus city clash, right? Boots versus boutique tents, diesel engines versus Instagram aesthetics. But it's a little more layered than that. The lesson here is reality doesn't adjust itself to match a story you're trying to sell, no matter how good that story looks on a website. And I'm not even saying Trevor was wrong for what he wanted to build. There's nothing inherently bad about creating experiences, about inviting people out to see a different kind of life. Honestly, I think more folks should spend time outside their bubble. But where it breaks down is when the experience gets sanitized, when you strip away the parts that are inconvenient or uncomfortable and still call it authentic. Because authenticity isn't curated. It doesn't show up on schedule, it doesn't lower its volume because someone paid for quiet, and it definitely doesn't check reviews before deciding how it behaves. From a psychological standpoint, what happened out there is something you see everywhere. People fall in love with an idea of a place before they ever understand the function of it. They project meaning onto it, build expectations around that meaning, and when reality doesn't line up, it feels like something is wrong, but not with their assumption, with the place itself. This is a psychological trap because it flips responsibility. It turns, I didn't fully understand what I was stepping into this environment should change to fit me. And once you're in that mindset, conflict is almost guaranteed. And it's not just about ranches. You see this in neighborhoods, in HOA disputes, in people moving next to airports, schools, nightlife districts, anywhere there's an existing system already in motion. According to standard procedure, the system doesn't pause just because someone new arrives, and from a legal perspective, it's not supposed to. There's a reason protections like right to farm laws exist, same way noise ordinances and zoning laws exist in cities. It's about preserving the original function of a place so it doesn't get pushed out by changing expectations. Because if that didn't exist, every working environment would eventually get regulated into silence by the people who showed up last. And then you'd lose the very thing that made the place interesting to begin with. But here's the part one keep coming back to. None of this required a fight. There was no shouting match, No lawsuits, no dramatic escalation, just two different worlds brushing up against each other until they either cracked or adjusted. Trevor adjusted his messaging. I stuck to my operations. And somewhere in the middle, a new kind of understanding formed. Not perfect, not friendly, but functional. And maybe that's the real takeaway. Coexistence doesn't always mean agreement. Sometimes it just means clarity. Knowing what something is and choosing it anyway. So if you were in that situation, if you booked a quiet getaway and woke up to engines, dust, and 100 head of cattle moving past your window, would you be frustrated? Or would you think, yeah, this is what real looks like? I'm curious where you land on that.